Hello, everybody. First of all, I really want to say thank you to the LEAP for having me and hosting this really critical conversation. This is really a pleasure. My name is Lauren Burke, and I'm with the Labor Network for Sustainability. We're a network of folks who are fighting for climate justice in the labor movement. Jody, a little bit more of an introduction, or than that, or?
Yeah, take another minute.
Okay, just checking. So I joined the labor movement first as a committee member and then became an organizer. And I really did it because I learned that our power as a movement comes from fighting for ourselves and fighting with and for people who may not be a whole lot like you. And when we do that right, it doesn't matter how much money the bosses or the fossil fuel companies have, we have more power than them. So I organized hotel workers and food service workers for over a decade. And in that work, there was a campaign we did called Real Food, Real Jobs, which was a contract fight in 5 university cafeterias in DC. And for me, when I first heard that idea, I was like, oh, our members aren't going to care about sustainable food in the cafeteria, but okay, we'll do it window dressing, no big deal. But when we started to talk with our members about the food that they serve every day, about food justice in their own communities, they were incredibly passionate and excited to have their expertise as cooks and their focus on care of students, really be part of the conversation we were having. And that committee really fought like hell to win that contract, to win a sustainability committee in that contract. And so when I started to engage on climate, I realized that the lessons I had learned in that campaign is really what we need to bring into this fight for climate justice. And so that's what I really try to do with my work every day.
Awesome, thank you, Lauren. Do you want to throw to someone else?
Raj.
Thanks, Lauren. And thank you, The Leap, and thank all y'all for joining us today. I am, in fact, talking to you from Texas, where I'm allowed to use y'all legally. And I came to this work through, in the 1990s, there was a lot of counter-globalization or alter-globalization work. And one of the first moments where the labor movement and the environmental movement came together was at the World Trade Organization protest in 1999, where the slogan was "Teamsters and Turtles Unite." Well, I mean, there were many slogans, but that was one of them. And I've sort of come to this work through that world. And so right now I'm a member of the United Auto Workers Local 1981, the National Writers Union. But my work in unions sits alongside my work with folk who tend not to be in the organized world of labor, in terms of, so folk like farm workers and farm worker movements around the world. But this is such an exciting moment because just like in 1999, there's this really interesting confluence again of workers and sustainability advocates and deep ecologists coming together in a sort of political formation that looks like it might be able to make real change. And I'm very excited to be thinking about how movements in the Green New Deal feed into one another. And I'm going to throw it to Meredith.
Thank you, Raj, and thank you, The Leap, and all of you for having me here, and thank you to everyone who's joining and doing the work. I do not come from an organizing background. I am an AI researcher. I'm the co-founder and co-director of the AI Now Institute at NYU, and I was at Google for 13 years and 5 days. And it was through my research looking at the social implications of AI that I actually came to organizing. And I was examining, what does it mean to deploy these powerful and often faulty technologies in real life contexts, in the context of, sort of sensitive social domains, making determinations that are often shaping lives and opportunities. How do we begin to account for these realities when we account for, when we talk about these technologies? How do we, flesh out a more realistic narrative that centers the humans whose lives are being shaped by these tools? And I've been thinking about that for many years. And the answers I was sort of, uncovering the sort of truth of what these technologies were doing, what they were capable of, were pretty stark. And I was inside the environments where they were being created. And I became increasingly concerned about the concentration of power in the tech industry, about the lack of accountability or oversight that would validate that, yes, these technologies are safe. Yes, these technologies are serving people who are, are serving the people and not just these sort of elites at the top of the tech companies. And I realized that even as I was sort of expressing, dissenting views and publishing dissenting papers and sort of, had a platform to say these things, we didn't have power to change them. So my organizing started around a project called Maven at Google, which was a secretive contract that the company had to build artificial intelligence surveillance for the US drone program. And that, it very clearly crosses a line. I doubt I have to explain that to many people on this call. But it sort of catalyzed for me the urgent necessity of a worker-led movement that could consider both the exploitation of workers within the company. So a lot of the contract workers, there are many, many workers in tech who do not get the benefits that these companies advertise, that could join concerns of exploitation of those workers with concerns about contributing to the exploitation of people outside of the company through building these powerful technologies, and begin to sort of build an intersectional movement that both took responsibility for the work that we were doing as tech workers and took responsibility for changing the environment of worker exploitation and sexual harassment and racism and sort of, corrosive heart of this extraordinarily elite industry. So I helped organize, I was one of the organizers of the Google walkout. I organized against, both against the sort of unethical projects and determinations that were being made by leadership, and for the rights of contract workers, and for, better processes around sexual harassment remediation, and just basic working condition improvements. So that's who I am.
Thank you. Thank you, Meredith. Yeah, some folks are asking more about that, and I am also super fascinated to hear more about that. But we've also been joined just now by Deena Ladd, who is our fourth panelist and the Executive Director of the Workers' Action Center. Deena, do you want to introduce yourself real quick to folks?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sounds great.
Yeah, great. So my name's Dina. I work in Toronto, Canada, and we run the Workers' Action Center, which is an organization that works with workers who are non-unionized. So working through temp agencies or on contract, undocumented, migrant workers, part-time, young workers. And so we've been running a campaign called the 15 and Fairness campaign, which is a provincial campaign to raise the standards for all workers, from getting paid sick days to getting a $15 minimum wage to getting equal pay for equal work, no matter what type of work you do. We do a lot of work around migrant workers issues as well. So dealing with farm workers, caregivers, workers coming in through the various immigration programs, and how they are basically forcing people to be undocumented. And so we fight for people's rights in terms of taking on employers who don't pay people their wages, and just do a lot of grassroots organizing in neighborhoods and in communities and building leadership.
Dina, was it you and your kids occupying the Premier of Ontario's office the other day?
That was me, yes. So
you left that out of your bio.
Yeah, I know.
Sorry, I'll go back to taking notes and questions.
Okay.
There's some backseat bioing going on. Thank you, Dina. And thanks all of you for introducing yourselves. So yeah, kind of zooming back out for a second, my first question to all of you is about the organizing of both unionized and non-unionized workers that you've all been working with. And thinking about right now, seeing a rise in unions demanding and winning both social and climate justice demands, for example, with this wave of really inspiring teacher strikes across the US that I'm sure folks know about. And at the same time, union rates being at a historic low point in Canada and the US, especially for millennials. And so I'm curious to know what you think about the role of unionized and non-unionized workers in the labor movement, playing and fighting for climate justice and a Green New Deal. We'll throw to Dina.
Oh, bloody hell, I got it. All right. So, I mean, I have to say, in Canada, we're just at the beginning of this. I think that, so for us, I'll talk about the work that we're doing. So we're really trying to bring together union and non-unionized workers outside the box. So I think that, you know, and Naomi talks about this in her book, that, you know, many of us are working in these silos. And one of the things that we've been trying to do with the 15 in Fairness campaign has been to break away those silos of community, union, non-union, temp, permanent, contract, and how do you build a labor movement that is based on the politics of unity and not division. We also see this when our immigration system tries to divide those of us who have status, who don't have status, you know, workers who get deported for speaking up at their workplace, or those workers who, you know, have citizenship and then, you know, also get treated really badly and lose their jobs. And so how do you break down the ways in which we are being divided by the immigration system and by our labor laws to unify? And I think if we're able to do that, then we'll be able to have a conversation around climate change and to be able to really understand how, in fact, our movements can work together. And so in 15 in Fairness, we've had, so not only have we done work around anti-Black racism, Islamophobia, you know, dealing with supports around Indigenous rights, but climate change is part of that struggle. And so when you have an integrated analysis and when you are not separating these issues out, so supporting Indigenous rights means taking on the issues that they faced with mercury poisoning of their river system. Dealing with low wage work means dealing with low carbon jobs, and the fact that many of the workers that we work with are working in jobs that would be considered to be low carbon. They're, you know, working with food, they're providing healthcare, they're doing education, childcare, all of these jobs that should be good jobs. And so so the work that we've been doing has been trying to integrate an analysis around understanding the connections between the types of workers that we're working with and how climate change is an integral part of that. I think that's just starting in Canada. I don't think that we have actually, we're not seeing the kinds of really interesting bargaining stuff that we're seeing in the US, for instance, where community interests are really part and parcel of the bargaining table. But I think that there's a real potential for that to happen in Canada. I think we're pushing our movements to say, you know what, we need to be having conversations around climate in the neighborhoods and in the communities that we work in. So for instance, we've been doing film screenings, we've been talking about the Green New Deal, we've been talking about what does climate change mean in our neighborhood organizing committees in different parts of Toronto. And we're having those hard conversations around, you know, what does this really mean to you, and what would you be willing to fight for? And I think that that's a really critical conversation, because if we don't understand how low wage workers, which are frankly the majority, and workers who are in unstable jobs and who don't have benefits and are trying to put food on the table, if we're not having a conversation with those communities about what does this mean to you, and how are you willing to fight for this? What does this mean to your family, for your kids? I'm not sure that we'll be able to build that strong movement. And so I'm hoping that the way in which Climate Justice Toronto has been organizing to sort of integrate many of the issues that communities are facing has taken a totally different tactic around climate change, because it's not just about climate change, it's around migrant justice and climate change. It's about decent work and climate change. It's around the $15 in climate change. And so we're really trying to integrate that analysis so that with the work that we're doing across the province, we're breaking down those barriers between us.
Awesome. Thank you, Dina. Yeah, and as you're talking about like breaking down the silos between unionized and non-unionized workers, and between climate justice and other struggles, and also between the labor movement and communities, Lauren, I was thinking about your work with the Labor Network for Sustainability and doing that solidarity organizing between the labor and climate justice movements. And I wonder if you could talk a bit more about what that organizing has looked like. And I know like a number of different unions and locals turned out in support of the climate strikes last month. So. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we're doing, at the Labor Network for Sustainability, we're doing a lot of work to really engage the labor movement in the broader fight for climate justice. And we did have great participation in the youth climate strikes last month now, in September, which was really exciting. And I do think that thinking about formal unions is also important too, because, you know, if we really think about unions, unions are an important institution for working people, and they're imperfect institutions, right? The labor movement is imperfect, but you know, when we're kind of thinking about how do we change the fossil fuel status quo, like we've got to change the institutions in our society that support that status quo. And so we're really thinking about how we engage unions on the issue of climate, how we build partnerships between unions and climate justice organizations, local organizations, and yeah, so we're really thinking about all of those different pieces. And you know, at the climate strikes, we really had a great, you know, we had at least 35 different labor bodies across the U.S. Like that count, I think, is a little bit low. But local unions, state fed, national unions. Yeah, so that was some of the work we did to really start building those bridges across the country for climate justice.
Raj, Meredith, do you want to speak to this broader question?
I can speak just quickly to sort of the question around unionized versus non-unionized workers. All of the organizing I have participated in the tech world has been non-unionized. And one of the reasons for that is we don't have a union, but we are also at Google in particular, which I'll use as my example, it's over 50% contract workers. So these are workers who do not work for Google. They work for an agency that then leases their labor out to Google. So Google has no responsibility to them as an employer, which means they don't have to provide healthcare. These workers can be exploited and sometimes significantly exploited. They don't have vacation days, et cetera. So, you know, that poses a real problem to unionizing under the NLRA as it's written right now in the US, which is the sort of law that allows you to, that, you know, kind of allows you to unionize. It's very imperfect. And this sort of split between sort of the workers who have the full privilege of employment, and I'm speaking about the US context, which is what I know, and the workers who do the same jobs, who do jobs that are integral to the operation of the company or the workplace, is a growing trend in the US. In tech, it's sort of over half the workforce is, you know, precarious employees that are often not afforded these privileges. Tech is also an international workforce. So one of the determinations that we made is one, we have a lot of energy around this. We have, you know, the engineers in tech have a significant amount of labor power, maybe some of the most labor power in the world right now because their skills are in demand. There aren't enough of them to fill demand. And so if we were to unionize, we would be leaving a lot of those workers out because they couldn't unionize with us. We would be leaving out international colleagues who actually, you know, were incredibly important to sort of making some of the arguments and putting pressure on the US-based company that was serving the US-based regime. So we there, you know, we decided that sort of we could act in solidarity, we could be sort of bold, and, you know, we could walk out, but that beginning to look at how we modify our need for collective action and worker power and solidarity to fit the extraordinarily narrow box that the NLRA gives us was not a good use of time. And if you look back at labor history, you know, the NLRA was won through illegal collective action. It was the red states in right to work states where there were no strike rules for federal employees that started sort of, you know, striking in Virginia and started this wave of teacher strikes, right? So I don't want to be the sort of anarchic force who's arguing for you know, law breaking, and I'm certainly not arguing against unions, but I'm saying in this case we would not have been able to build any of the power we had, and we would have actually been starting in a position where we're already excluding the most marginalized workers at our company and ignoring the fact that sort of the global nature of technology and the global nature of the company we were at would have also cut out, you know, 50% of the workers who were international. So I think the architecture we used was really like, what is the goal? Like, what is the ideal form? Does this ideal form bear any resemblance to what is sort of technically possible under these rules? Well, it doesn't. So we're not going to pay attention to those. We're going to move forward to do what we know would sort of help us achieve this goal. And I think that's part of how we were able to get 20,000 people around the world out in the streets, because, and a lot of them didn't know labor law and didn't realize they were striking. So that was also helpful, because we had people who realized the sort of moral and ethical urgency of this issue, but had not sort of been steeped in the minutia of, I don't know, a labor discourse that might have been made them more hesitant to do that if they were frightened of breaking the law or of, you know, international coordination or any of the other things. Yeah.
Dina, looks like you wanted to respond directly.
You're just going to bust out of that box if we're not careful.
You can see my hand signals. I mean, I think what Meredith is talking about is really quite important, because I think it's about how do we inspire people? How do we create a vision? And that's been part of this whole, you know, the Green New Deal and trying to get people to think outside the box. And the same thing is with labor organizing. And with the 15 and fairness, we sort of threw out all of those old boxes and we said, you know, what if we raised the standards and the wages for the person right at the bottom, for the person who had the least protection and had zero rights under our labor standards, and we started from there and we moved up. And what we found in those conversations and in that organizing where we've built now this provincial movement is that when you say, you know, no one is to be left behind, what that really means is going from the person who is the undocumented migrant worker and building from that. And when you start from that premise, then you will raise everybody else up. And that has been very inspiring, I think, for us in terms of our organizing and in building very strong alliances, tearing down those silos, but in actually also achieving change. And so we managed to win a lot of progressive labor law changes in 2018 in Ontario, which in 2017, which, you know, obviously 10 months later were taken down by the Ford government. But it gave people a taste of what it would mean to actually inject equality and equity into the into labor organizing. So when you're pushing from the bottom, saying that no matter what your employer decides to call you, whether it's a temp agency worker, a contract, or how they're hired, they cannot pay you less than the regular hired workers. What that does is start to transform people's relationships with each other. And it means that people actually start to see their connection with each other in fighting back.
Raj, what are you thinking about in relation to all this?
Well, I mean, I want to echo what everyone else has been saying, that you know, organizing around work doesn't necessarily have to be the same thing as unionizing. And when you think about the low carbon jobs of the future, they're the ones, certainly in the United States, where unionizing has been prohibited. So, you know, it's care work, it's work in farming and in the food system, the lowest paying jobs. And that, I mean, that sort of wall-to-wall organizing is stuff that you're seeing a great deal of, and with some really creative strategies around coming from, particularly in the food movement, coming to be able to circumvent the limits that have been put down by the strictures of the NLRB. But I also think that there's still work to do here. I mean, I have in mind an image of the Extinction Rebellion protest in London, where there was an Extinction Rebellion organizer on a tube train who gets pulled down by the commuters. And at one level, this is a moment of reaction and of bad faith. But on the other hand, it suggests that it's an organizing opportunity where Extinction Rebellion might be working with the precariat in ways that I think need to be read as an opportunity. And in just the same way as there's some radical organizing happening with the Gilets jaunes, for example, there are ways in which sort of working class people who have been really damaged by neoliberalism and who will find a much better world after the Green New Deal need to be organized with. Otherwise, they're going to see Extinction Rebellions as the unwashed, as opposed to comrades.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I just jump in a little bit too? So yeah, I agree entirely that, it is important that we organize all workers, and we've got to remember that unions do still represent a good number of workers, and they are democratic institutions, right? And that's actually a real strength of unions, is the fact that unions are democratic, they're funded by their members, they're responsible to their members and their livelihoods, right? Like, when I was kind of saying unions are an institution of the working class, they literally are. And so while we do really need to experiment and engage in other ways of organizing, we can't forget the power that labor unions do have. And the fact that labor unions, one of the chief tools is negotiating a legally binding contract and then not expecting the bosses to follow that contract, but being prepared that members and shop stewards and that the union is going to enforce that contract, right? When I think about international climate agreements, I wish we had that kind of power when we're thinking about international climate agreements, right? There are a lot of tools in the formal union toolbox that I think are really important to our fight. And there's still a lot of power in the institution of formal unions as well. And so I think we've got to be able to do both of these things at the same time, right? Engage with formal unions in unionization efforts and kind of new alternative ways of organizing because of the ways that we're constrained by labor law. Absolutely.
Lauren, I want to bring a couple of questions from the chat and the people listening because they speak directly to this point. So Patricia just posted a really interesting way of crystallizing this very challenge, saying at this very moment there are hotel workers on strike in downtown Vancouver. One result of the hotel industry's decision to persuade guests to have them do laundry less often is workers' wages and hours being cut. Guests get a Starbucks reward card and workers get lower pay. So the question is, how do we respond to this to ensure that those low-wage workers see climate as a concern for them to organize around, rather than, as we've seen in the Yellow Vest, the Gilets jaunes in France, and many other examples around the world, where working class people are being told that they have to pay the higher taxes or the transportation fees or whatever, and pay for the cost of climate action. There's another example, which is a strike right now where a union in the way is caught in the middle, or even worse, on the wrong side of that dynamic. So what is the response? Dina has good. Let's jump in. You guys all jump in now.
Yeah, but I want to say those workers aren't on the wrong side, right? We also have to listen to workers' expertise when they're pointing out examples of corporate greenwashing. And that's what those workers are doing, those hotel workers are doing. Marriott is one of the key greenwashers, saying, oh, if you don't wash your towels, and housekeepers don't work today, that somehow this is going to save the environment. And there's no science behind that. You know, if you ask the housekeepers who are actually cleaning those rooms, it takes twice as much chemicals to clean it after it hasn't been cleaned for a couple days. So, you know, we can't automatically assume that the corporate narrative that, oh, workers are on the wrong side of green is true, right? It's
actually, I said
workers are against
some unions are on the wrong side, which I was kind of forecasting the next question. I wouldn't have said that workers are on the wrong side, but that's a really interesting way of complicating that. Dina, you were going to jump into.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this example is exactly why we need to open up these conversation points, right? And not have these silos and build these really strong coalitions, because again, you know, some of us roll our eyes when, you know, we hear folks talking about, oh, these new green jobs, you know, retrofitting buildings, or you know, this is the wave of the future, because sometimes it's like, well, what's that going to mean to the communities that we work with? Like, are they ever going to get access to those jobs? Because there's so much streamlining that happens in the labor market in terms of who gets access to those jobs. And so I think it's so critical. Like, I mean, one example I'll give you is, you know, this whole push around recycling, right? Well, the recycling plant in Toronto, when the government was reviewing labor laws, one of the biggest issues that we were bringing up was temporary agency work. And one of our members had been working in a recycling plant, you know, sorting through construction waste, and had been working through the same temp agency at this recycling plant for 5 years. The same recycling plant was getting major contracts by the city of Toronto. But what they would do was separate the conveyor lines in the recycling plant so that, you know, household garbage got recycled, and those jobs on those lines got the better pay. But the construction site garbage that was not part of the city of Toronto contracts, they were basically the worst jobs, the most dangerous jobs. Those workers were not even getting any health and safety equipment. They were working in treacherous conditions, and for years through the same agency, making minimum wage, no benefits. And so when our member spoke up about getting rid of temp agencies, he immediately lost his assignment. But then it kind of exposed this whole kind of relationship that this huge recycling plant that received so many government grants and contracts. And so the thing is that as we start to work together, you know, climate change activists, unions, workers, like worker centers, you know, groups that are doing grassroots groups, work in communities with low wage work, we have to kind of really be making sure that our strategies are grounded in the communities that we work with. Otherwise, you'll have really shitty situations like the one that happened in London around the commuters, or, you know, around the situation where workers are losing their jobs and they're like, what the hell, right? Like, I believe in the environment, but I got to pay the rent this month, you know? So I think it really speaks to the kind of solid, on the ground conversations and very difficult conversations that we have to start having.
Meredith, it looked like you wanted to jump in just there too.
Yeah, I would echo what Lauren and Dina said. I don't think you convince people to care about your cause. That has not been my experience. I think, you know, there's a lot of history of sort of movements trying to, you know, say like, you know, convince the working class to get involved in, you know, suffrage or whatever. And they're like, we don't have food. Why are you asking us to abstract? And I think climate is not one of those abstract issues. You know, it may not be an issue that is material in some direct way to exploitation at the workplace, but I would imagine the most, you know, in many, you know, most cases, the most exploited workers are also those who live in, you know, places where climate racism is present, where, you know, they put the waste dumps in their backyard, they don't maintain the infrastructure. There are a number of climate justice issues that are, you know, hurting the lives of the same people, which is why I think these sort of breaking down the barriers, so that if you are, you know, the kind of bargaining for the common good or social justice unionism has to be at the core of these issues. Because if you're looking at, you know, if you center the most marginalized folks and you say, like, what are, who's going to bear the effects most, who's getting kind of, excluded from resources, who is bearing the cost of being around the sort of waste and kind of climate emergency, who doesn't get rescued when you have extreme weather, et cetera, it's those same people, right? So the movement around, like with the Chicago teachers, where they are also talking about housing displacement, they are also talking about sort of, the lives of their students. You saw this in Los Angeles with the teachers movement there, I think is really important. So it's not a sort of, it's not people who sort of think about these issues going with an admonition to the poor saying this is really important, it will affect you. It's asking, like, how does this affect you across the full spectrum of your life, and how do we begin to incorporate that in our organizing so that we are actually centering kind of the betterment of your conditions as part of how we pursue climate justice, or part of how we pursue any justice cause.
Yeah, Raj.
Well, I just, Meredith, you put that so beautifully. I mean, that's it. I mean, all good community organizing is already intersectional, because that's how we live our lives. And I just wanted to make a historical point about how the original New Deal happened, because it was precisely that there was, 4 million workers were on strike in 1919, for example. As sort of 4% of the US's population was on strike. And it was through the 1920s that the union movement, well, actually through the working class people, not even the union movement, it was short, unions were there, but the working class exceeded the union movement. And it was through precisely understanding, look, we need to go on strike because we care about the conditions of workers, but we also care about the conditions of people who are making the food for workers, and we care about the conditions of the people who are building the houses and getting the energy for workers. And all of a sudden understanding that there are these multiple connections in the ways that people live their lives that make it possible not just to demand a better contract, but to demand that the people become the government. I mean, this is the misunderstanding, I think, about the New Deal, not in this chat room, but for folk who haven't read Naomi's book, that it would appear that the New Deal was sort of sprinkled from on high by FDR. And it wasn't. It was always fought for by unions. It was on the terms demanded by unions and working class organizers. And I think, if we're thinking about how to address the Vancouver story, we also need to be thinking about the sort of social movement infrastructure that allows us to dream beyond the sort of confines of the ways that Marriott gets to exploit workers right now, and makes us rethink how it is that we might have an economy of care and of people traveling and staying places, rather than thinking about, oh, well, Marriott's just needs to pay its workers a little better and everything's going to be okay.
Just to draw a close to that great example that the chat brought us to, and the wisdom of the audience in the LEAP webinar world. Laura posted a subversive response to the greenwashing in hotels issue. If you're a hotel guest, this is something Laura heard at a labor conference, go ahead and hang the "please clean my room" card on your door, and leave a note for the cleaners in your room saying, just take a rest while you're here. So they'll still get paid for cleaning the room. And that's an audience hack. Just thought I'd throw it in there.
Thank you, Laura. And speaking, Raj, of dreaming beyond, like you were just saying, I want to come back to this idea of kind of like right to work laws and like where and for whom it's legal to unionize and organize and strike. And Stephanie here in the chat has also asked a question about this. And I also want to know more generally how you think our like political imagination for like collective worker-led action has been constrained like by labor laws, by corporations and the capital class, and like the criminalization of this kind of organizing. And what do you think needs to change?
I mean, I think the aftermath of the New Deal is one long punishment for workers, right? I mean, since the 1940s, the capitalists have been wreaking their revenge for the alternative that was written in the 1930s and 1940s. So we are seeing the wherever there is the dream of an alternative, it is crushed and considered an enemy of the state, whether that's about red baiting and about the war on communism, or whether that's more recently about the attacks on environmentalists. Certainly the criminalization of protests after 9/11 have all been part of that. But also what's exciting is that there are, even in Florida, for example, one of the most inspiring organizations is the, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which works with migrant workers to be able to strike back at food corporations, not through their labor brokers who are anonymous and powerful, but by going after brands and by waging moral war on these brands. There've been some fairly important victories for food workers and for laborers in the tomato fields in Florida. And so, I think, yes, the criminalization of protest is widespread, and the fear of being branded a terrorist and the fear of what's going on strike means is something that that's a recognizable one, and that fear is compounded by the onerous debt that more and more people are living under, particularly in the United States, with student debt, where that becomes a compelling internalized force to return to work, even though your best interest might lie in remaining on strike. But I do think that what we're seeing now with the rise in the number of strikes is a really exciting cultural shift that recognizes that actually, yes, you can go on strike, and yes, you can win.
Oh, this is Dina. Yeah, I agree. I think that we're for us in Canada, it was really inspiring to see the kind of organizing around the Fight for 15 in the US, where we had so many workers who were low-paid workers working at McDonald's and Wendy's and Burger King and all of these fast food restaurants, walking off the job and for their rights, and then walking back in. It raised this whole incredible level of conversation around what is a decent job, what should work, like raising people's expectations. And I think one of the biggest things that we've seen is that, many of our communities have been really beaten down, right? Like a lot of people are like, you should be grateful to have a job, instead of like, you should actually have a decent job. You deserve to have a decent job. You deserve to have benefits. You deserve to go to work and not get killed on the job, right? Like these are conversations that we're having in communities where we're trying to raise people's expectations. And I think to be able to, obviously in the US, you have the Section 7, which allows people to do a concerted activity. We don't have that in Canada, but what we have been trying to do on the ground is also build people's confidence in doing radical actions, in trying to train people and build people's confidence of how to do those actions. And so an example would be, when the Ontario government raised the minimum wage to $15 after our organizing, it went from $11.25 to $15. It was going up to $15 in 18 months. Obviously, massive outcry. The first step was going up to $14 on January 1st, 2018. And so many corporations then had this huge backlash against working people to punish them for this. And so it started with Tim Hortons, right, which is a massive company here. Obviously, everybody loves their Timmy's, their double. And so what they did was they said, okay, now we're going to take away your Timbits. We're not going to allow you to have a coffee break. We're going to make you pay for your uniforms. What we saw there, though, was a massive outcry of the public in support of those Tim Hortons workers, and that this is like across Canada. But what did that mean on the ground? So with us in the communities that we've worked with, right, what we were able to do, like shortly after we did a provincial day of action, a national day of action, was we actually were able to do direct actions in 300 stores in one day. Now, how do you do that with workers from the community playing that role? So this wasn't, your typical union activists or your community activists going in, but what we did was step by step, like in neighborhoods, we had groups of workers do 13 Tim Hortons actions in one day, because there's so many in a neighborhood, right? They're at the end of your bloody street, right? And so what we're able to do is like say, okay, you know, were we going to call it a strike? Were we going to call it a direct action? No, but what we're going to do is you're going to just take over the store for a little while, and you're going to read out a letter. We're going to give out Valentine's cards on Valentine's Day to all the workers, give them chocolates, say that we respect them, even if their bloody company doesn't, right? And most of the workers on the ground that we're working with, that was their first taste of doing stuff like that. And so the thing is, you have to build confidence, and you have to build the support and the infrastructure to support low wage workers to do that work, and then be there every step of the way. Now, if you'd have told me 2 years previous that we would have been able to hit 300 stores in one day, I'd have been like, oh, the pigs are flying outside my window right now. But what we're able to do through like grassroots training and support and step-by-step leadership development in neighborhoods and having those hard conversations, then it was very easy, because people were angry and they were pissed off, and they'd been part of that fight, and then they wanted to challenge these corporations. And so I think part of how you take on those kinds of constraints that are put on by corporations in conjunction with government is large institutions like some unions become very conservatized by that. And so we need to find, again, alternative ways to break down those boxes so that, you know, union rank and file workers can join with us to do those actions. The unions may not support them, or maybe their unions do, but it doesn't really matter, because it's coming from neighborhoods, it's coming from communities. And so I think part of it is trying to find those ways in which all of those pieces connect, and where you're able to kind of have a long-term grounded strategy of building the strength in communities step by step.
Yeah, I would say on the imagination question is like, one of the challenges is we can't even imagine unions and the labor movements as like a real institution and voice for all working people, right? When I organize, especially folks who are building to win the union, we talk about, you know, the boss wants you to third party the union, that it's not about you and it's not about your coworkers, but the union's the person down in the union hall. And that's a boss tactic, right? To get us to think that we're not the union. And like, you know, that's really limited us, that we can't even see the labor movement as a place where working people can envision the good life, right? We're limited by these capitalist understandings of what the good life is. The union movement was hugely engaged in redefining what we thought as the good life in the 20th century, and constrained by, you know, what, you know, always having growth and all of those sorts of things that we saw in the 20th century, and that being part of the good life, right? And we're really in a moment right now where we have to redefine what we think of as the good life. And labor really can play a critical role in doing this. You know, and if we step back and look at the Chicago teacher union's demands, that fight that they're having right now is about creating a new vision of the good life. It's about care of community. It's about decent housing. It's about health for the students in the communities. And it's a great example about how unions can actually be at the forefront of creating a new vision of the good life.
Thank you, Lauren. And before I throw to you, Meredith, for perhaps the final word on this question with 5 minutes left, I just want to throw in a little audience follow-up. We've gotten a few questions about the implications of the tech industry being mostly non-unionized, and also like the rise of surveillance technologies and AI for worker organizing. So yeah, over to you.
Well, I'm forming that into a question. Yes, there is AI, and surveillance technologies are a real threat, not just to organizing, but to work generally. And it's not because they will displace workers. To, you know, AI still needs a huge amount of bodies to operate these systems. If you've ever been to like a grocery store with a self-checkout, you will know that they never work, and there's always sort of bored employees standing around trying to ease the problems with the machine that doesn't quite function the way it's designed to function. So, you know, all the way down the line, there is the need for maintenance. There is the need for a lot of sort of precarious work to train these systems. That's a whole nother talk. But I just want to disavow the robots are taking your jobs narrative. That's incredibly convenient to message to workers that they actually should not demand more power. They should not demand better wages because they are on the brink of extinction. So even having a job is something they should be grateful for. That's not true. These systems require a huge amount of human labor, but they also are, they serve to kind of degrade that labor. So what you will see is people will bring in these sort of automated systems. They will bring in, in a number of low wage work, kind of Amazon warehouses are a good example. They will bring algorithmic management systems. So your boss is no longer a human. Your boss is a system that is calibrated to extract as much labor out of you as possible. And in the warehouse context, these workers are given sort of a numerical target to meet, and that's however many boxes they pull, however many packages they ship, whatever, you have to meet that target. If you make 3 mistakes in one day, that's a fireable offense. And the algorithm is calibrated to be able to fire you automatically. It doesn't matter what your tenure is. It doesn't matter if you have a health condition. It doesn't matter if you have, your humanity doesn't matter. And it's very difficult to appeal those decisions. So this is sort of a kind of monstrous form of automated Taylorism in a way that is being implemented through these systems that are calibrated for sort of centralized control of workers and to put sort of these sort of technological barriers between workers and the people who are ultimately accountable for their conditions. That didn't answer the question perhaps, but I think we need to look at these technologies as technologies of population control, as technologies of worker control, and as technologies that are specifically calibrated to extract as much value out of workers and other human beings in other ways as possible, and kind of pooling that in the hands of 5 corporations in the US. And there are reasons why there are no more than that, because the amount of infrastructure it takes, the amount of data it takes, and sort of what the resources you need to build AI are not things you can just acquire. They're things that are vastly expensive. So there's another talk about sort of the myths that we're told about these technologies versus the reality and their implications for human beings, and how we begin to navigate, systems that are set up to make it difficult to organize, to make it difficult to demand, better working conditions and better lives. I can also talk about the environmental impact of AI. The tech sector by 2020 is projected to have a carbon footprint larger than aviation. Training one AI model. So this is just like one system. There are millions and millions of systems out there. Training one AI model once takes as much carbon as flying 125 times between Beijing and New York. So we're looking at something that is often talked about as the cloud, or these sort of dematerialized metaphors that make us sort of think they're almost free, or don't have kind of material impacts on our lives. That's not true. And if we look at the way that the tech companies, these data centers, these large infrastructures are hugely carbon intensive, and they're building more and more and more of them to support the deployment of ubiquitous networks, technologies, and artificial intelligence everywhere. Not only are they doing that, but they are applying artificial intelligence they're basically leasing these systems to large oil and gas companies to help them basically speed up the extraction of reserves. So you're seeing these extremely carbon intensive technologies that take so many resources to build, then being applied to speed up the climate crisis effectively. And you see these companies also producing the surveillance technologies, the policing technologies, facial recognition, tracking, network analysis, all of these things that are being applied at the borders, which are being used right now to create this sort of fortified infrastructure that is excluding the people who are facing the sort of bellwether harms of climate from the resources they would be entitled to in a just world, in countries that are most responsible for the climate crisis and where the most resources are pooled. So this is part of the way that as tech workers, when we've been organizing around climate, and there was the first cross-tech action happened in September 20th on the climate strike, where 12 companies, workers walked out, making demands around these, including the demand to stop providing technology that harmed climate refugees. So stop providing facial recognition to ICE, stop providing border technology, stop providing the infrastructure to police communities who experience environmental harm. And this was, I think this is the kind of thinking we need to do as we build a labor movement in these sectors that touch so many other areas of our lives, and as we build a labor movement that can be, or a movement that can be resilient to the economic shocks, to the kind of climate shocks that are going to traverse every single issue we could organize around. And I can pass people an article on this as well. That was really rushed. That was a whole talk in like 3 seconds.
Terrifyingly efficient, Meredith.
Yeah, there's so many threads in what all of you have said that I want to pick up on. And also I wish we could get to all of the comments and the questions that are happening in the chat right now. Some really amazing stuff. But as we close, I want to throw to each of you to ask if you have any calls to action or things you want to share right here in the chat with folks who are listening, ways that they can get involved or support work that each of you are doing. And Raj, I know you have to head out soon, so maybe I'll throw it to you first.
Well, I mean, I certainly think join a union's a good idea if you can. But I mean, I think that there are so many movements out there that are, deeply inspirational. I think it's about finding the place where you and your community are to be able to start that organizing. And I'm excited that, as I say, I mean, I am a union member, and that union provides me with the kind of resources I need to organize with. And there is a union near you that can do the same.
If you are in a union, talk to your union about, put your union on the issue of climate, right? Like, get engaged, build a committee in your union, talk to leadership, organize in your union to move your union on the issue. If you're not in a union, talk to unions in your area, right? Listen to what their issues are. I put a link in the chat box, laborforsustainability.org. That's LNS's webpage. It's labor spelled in the American way, labor for the number sustainability.org. I also put a link, support hotel housekeepers in their fight against false green solutions, right? There's a pledge you can sign that you're going to refuse the Green Choice program. Go sign that. Supporting workers in their fights is a really important part of solidarity. So please take that action.
I think I would suggest, so one of the big issues that we're dealing with is many workers that we work with can't join a union because they're working through temp agencies. And so we've had the 5th worker die at Fiera Foods, which is a huge food company in North York, in Ontario. And the Ford government, which is the provincial government, is sitting on legislation that actually has already been passed and the regulations have been written, but he's refusing to sign it. And what it would mean was the company that uses temp agency workers would be held liable for any accidents that happen in their workplace. And so we really need people supporting temp agency workers who have a very little voice in the workplace. And this, for instance, the last person that died was 4 weeks ago, was a temp agency worker who'd been working in this plant for 5 years, and then was crushed in an industrial mixer. And so, so please go to the 15andfairness.org website. There's petitions and there's ways for people to get involved in local organizing, but in also to pressure the government right now on this piece of legislation that could make a huge difference to the hundreds and thousands of temp agency workers that have no protection when they go to work every day. And so that's one of the biggest things that I would push people to do right now, as well as supporting Grassy Narrows and the fight against mercury poisoning, and making sure that people are donating money and supporting their call for a mercury treatment facility to stop the harmful effects of government neglect for decades around what that community is dealing with.
Meredith, any final calls to action?
Well, if you're not in a union, or if you work in a mixed workplace with temp and non-temp workers where you want to build solidarity, just talk to your coworkers, like ask them how they're doing. It's a radical act to begin to build real relationships in a context that is structured by capital, where there's often a lot of gaslighting. And I think what we did started with just sitting down with people and saying like, hey, we don't like this. Tell me about, what you think. Tell me about your experience here, and began to build sort of the ability to talk openly about what we were feeling at work and what we might want to do about it. So that, that in itself, if you don't have a union to join, I think can lead to some pretty effective action. And you just end up having really good friends at work that you wouldn't have met otherwise. And it can make these alienating environments a little better.
Yeah.
Thank you. I love building relationships as a radical act. Avi, and I'll throw to you to pitch our webinar for tomorrow as a closing.
Great. Well, it was a real treat to have a front row seat to this conversation, and a very lively chat. I think, incidentally, the notion of hotel rooms and cleaners really sparked a lot of conversation. So it's obviously one of those endpoints where people can flesh out their analysis and think about action that is systemic in its focus and not just individual. So that's exciting to see. We're doing another webinar tomorrow. There was an important election in Canada 8 days ago, and the electoral landscape is transformed. And it was an election in which there was probably more social movement intervention than we've seen in a long time, particularly around Green New Deal candidates and candidates who are connecting the dots between climate emergency and worker rights. And so we want to have a conversation around this perennial intersection of the inside and the outside dynamic around the electoral system, and how social movement players and actors can have the most impact and not break themselves on the very exploitative electoral machine, but actually win change without leaving the grassroots community struggle. So we have some comrades from around the world who are going to help us with this. We have someone from the DSA, Political Democratic Socialists of America, who's joining us, Emma from Momentum UK, one of the co-founders of Momentum UK. And we have a brand new member of parliament in Canada, Matthew Green from Hamilton Centre, a fantastic community organizer, former city councillor, and now member of parliament from the Rust Belt, who ran on a radical platform, more radical than his parties, as part of that conversation. It's tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern. I'm going to be moderating that one. Jody's going to already put a link in the chat if anyone who's watching this one wants to come for our all webinars all the time leap work. It seems to be a good place to chat. Thanks, everyone.
Okay,
Jody, do you have final words?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us, and thank you again to our 4 panelists for a really brilliant conversation.
Thank you.
Bye.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.